Welcome back to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast, powered by ISOFIT, Firefly Recovery, and Engage Movement. ISOFIT is my go-to for all things isometric strength training. For more on ISOFIT, be sure to check out isofit.com. Firefly Recovery is the official recovery provider of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast. For more on Firefly, be sure to check out recoveryfirefly.com. This episode is also powered by Dr. Ray Gorman, the founder of Engage Movement. Learn how to boost your income without relying on sessions and get a free training on the blended practice model by following Ray Gorman DPT on Instagram. Enjoy. Zach, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today, man. For people who aren't familiar with you, the incredible work you're doing up there in Montana, and in particular, in that return to play kind of phase of athlete rehabs, if you will, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are, and all the great stuff you have going on?
Yeah. So obviously, at the University of Montana, where I operate as the director of athletic performance, oversee all Olympic sports outside of basketball, and then football as well has their own head. And then I just oversee volleyball and track and field, everything besides distance for the most part. That being said, though, I still have a thumb on kind of like what's going on and things like that. And we really try to drive, a team approach on our staff. Just because you never know when someone might be out, someone might need to cover, right? If I need to run a football group, like that'd be pretty cool, so we're all on the same page and we really, have a team atmosphere with here where everyone has their own designated teams and assignments. But we could fill in if we need to. If we get in a pinch. And I think that's a very neat and unique opportunity for a lot of people to see because there's a lot of siloed approaches at a lot of different places. And that it really can hamper success, I think, of the department itself, but also the learning process for someone who, wants to work in collegiate athletics, where no matter where you're at, it's always going to be different. And I think if you've only seen it done one way, right, if we get an intern from one place to here, and they see it this way and they're like, oh, I really like that. And then they go to a place where, say it's run in a siloed approach. How do you knock down those barriers, right? How do you have those conversations? Because I think we can all learn from each other. We generally just have to be given the opportunity or create it ourselves. And those conversations lend themselves to have deeper understanding on, whether it's the professional side or the personal side. Like we talk about finance with our GAs and with our interns. Like it's important that you understand what you're signing up for. And it's important you have the tools to accomplish the job on the professional side and the personal side. So we try to do a really good job and we break down our internship like that. So like every coach on staff tends to have an area that they have ownership over within the grand scheme of the development side, which is pretty cool. And that kind of segues into, kind of the return to play stuff. I try to help everyone on staff have a very consistent process with their return to play. And the reason why is because if we refer out to PT, if we refer out for imaging, and maybe it's not in network, like it's a kid in Southern California, right? And they go home, like what's our process look like on our end to ensure that it's somewhat consistent, it's somewhat in order of maybe how we want to attack, this injury, whether it's surgical, non-surgical, whatever that looks like. And we're consistent with that. And then we can really see if we're making dents, in the timeline side, right? If we can speed or return to play up, 2 weeks, and they can be back to full go for 2 weeks, like that just could be 2 weeks that they're getting better at the sport, not focused on all the other sides. And there's a lot of components to that. Don't get me wrong. And so there's a lot of context that obviously needs to be, talked on, but the infrastructure of trying to help and drive, some good conversations within the concepts we want to get done, only can be had once we understand the infrastructure, the ecosystem of how it all operates. And so for me, it's just like trying to drive that and paint that picture for everyone to understand. Yes, we can do it that way, but if we do it that way, here's the issues we're going to run into potentially later. And as long as we know those, I think it's okay for us to make whatever decision we feel is very comfortable. I'm not the one that oversees and says, you're not going to do that. I was like, I think you could do that. I think that works. This could be a better option. Or, hey, that sounds great. Like, what's your next steps towards getting to the goal right? And training always has fundamental goals with all the inputs that we're giving the athlete or stresses we're applying to it. And so it should be manageable. It should be measurable. So yeah, so it's quite a bit I'm trying to do. And then I also teach on the academic side too as an adjunct. And so trying to do something similar there, right? Where I can talk to the PT students, I can talk to the athletic training students. The athletic trainings come down, and they spend a day with us or a couple days with us, looking at what training looks like. We have an immersion program where it's a self-select. We take one PT in the fall for I think it's like 30 or 40 hours. They work with one team pretty much that works to their schedule, and they really get to see the nuances of strength and conditioning. Try to put them with a team that has a decent amount of return to plays on it. Decent, we're talking like hopefully 1 to 3, right? For a very large roster. I don't like teams being hurt, but it creates a good challenge for us. But now they can see kind of the limitations to our process. And then they can really see the role that they can help and own. They don't need to do all of it, just like we don't need to do all of it, but we need to understand each other's roles and where we can really help benefit the athlete. Because if the athlete isn't here, none of us have jobs, none of us have anything to do. And so I think we need to understand that and cater it a lot to what we're trying to accomplish.
Absolutely. I love the way you outlined all of that, Zach. And just to run it back here, I mean, first off, as you mentioned, we all have that athlete as the commonality amongst us, whether you're the AT, the PT, the team chiro, sports nutritionist, strength coach, sports science guy, whatever the heck your title is. We all do what we do to work with the athlete at the end of the day. And as you mentioned, you used the term siloed. Us as professionals have been, in my opinion, siloed for way too long. A lot of times the athlete is the only point of contact between professions. We don't know what the other's doing. We don't know what they're up to. We don't know how much. We don't know anything. And the athlete is trying to relay that to us, and it turns into this giant game of telephone, which return to play in general is not an easy time frame in the rehab for, most people to do alone. It's even more difficult when you're getting mixed signals from one person who's actually getting more stressed out and kind of adding more insult to injury, if you will, by the fact that they're the only person. They don't fully understand the language and everything going on, but they're the only person actually talking to everyone out of the entire landscape here. So I think we do need to break those walls down and become less siloed here. And in order to do that, part of it comes from checking your ego as a professional, right? There's a situation that popped up in a consultation I was doing recently where essentially the PT was saying, you know what, I've got this, I'm going to steer the ship. And part of his advice to this individual, this athlete, was because your quad index is so bad at this phase of your rehab, we need to stop training your involved leg so they can catch up and close the gap. Now, my advice was a little bit different than stop training the non-involved limb altogether. However, for some reason, this individual felt the need to just shut everyone else out and step up and take charge, which in my opinion is not necessarily the way to do it. Yes, you can be called to be the leader, but at the same time, this should be more of a team-based approach. Athletes play team sports. You work with Olympic athletes, which are largely team-based. It's not necessarily one person on a volleyball team, maybe in beach, but you're still part of a team. You're part of something greater than yourself. And I think that's one of the many mistakes I see in this return to play continuum, if you will, is one person tries to carry the weight of the entire team. They think they can do it all themselves, when in reality, nothing is further from the truth. It takes all of us coming together. And there might be times when you're called to lead and step up and take charge. There's other times when you're called to actually take more of a backseat role and let someone else lead. And I think the best way to do that is, like you mentioned, unite everyone together, get everyone to understand each other's strengths and weaknesses, the language they use, what they're really good at, and then understand how can we all come together to leverage what we're good at in the best interest of the athlete. But obviously, that's easier said than done. How did you go about implementing that with success at Montana?
I think the first thing to do is we obviously built stuff out when I was at SIUE and stuff like that. So I'm coming into a situation where, hey, I've done this, right? Like, I feel like I'm good at it. I can help, but I'm the new kid on the block. Like that doesn't I have to understand what the temperature in the landscape looks like here before I can ever really try to fit anything to work. And And a lot of that's because I'm going to come in and be like, hey, you're doing it wrong. Regardless of what I say, that's how it's going to be perceived. And I get it. And I would never want anyone to come in and tell me how what I'm doing, like it could be better. It could be changed. And so really like my thought process is, okay, we need to speak the same language. So when you say that, what are you referring to? Right. I think that's really important. Because when we say things like strength, okay, what does that mean? Right. People say core all the time. Oh, your core is weak. I was like, well, are you referring to like just rectus abdominis? Like transverse, like what are we referring to when we say those things, right? Is it just a blanket term? Can you be specific? Can you objectify it, right? From a testing standpoint, have objective measures. And then some of the stuff is just like, it's the eye test, right? Or whatever. And so, but for us, that was kind of big, is like verbiage is very important, right? Status of athletes, making it very consistent on the verbiage side. So that way, when I see it, I know exactly what questions I need to ask for clarification, right? Like that's super important for me in order to do a good job, is to understand the boundaries I have. The other thing is that we've begun to implement is kind of create like a roadmap of where we're at. And so what the roadmap process allows us to do, and this is more of a newer thing that we've started, it's really allowed us to outline kind of our direction we're going, but not necessarily blindsiding anyone in the process. So we know certain tissues are different healing times and things like that, right? So quad tendon versus a hamstring graft versus a cadaver. The ACL is probably the easiest, right? Meniscus, no meniscus. Really good questions to ask, because a lot of times the strength coaches, we hear, oh, they can't do lower body. Why can't they do lower body? It's like, well, they have meniscus tear and it wasn't a meniscectomy where they took it out. They stitched it. So you can't have the rubbing in between the knuckles for a certain amount of time because the suture needs to heal. Okay, well, that is a tissue timeline. That's not a performance metric. And so we do have to understand those things. And I think that roadmap, and it's 30 to 45 minutes, right? And every stakeholder brings their things that they see, and we all agree upon kind of these landmarks we want to touch and things and objectives we want to hit. And so say in that key stakeholder, that roadmap conversation, we have a meniscus, right? There's also a hamstring graft. Okay, well, what limitations does that play, or is that put in front of us that we need to make sure we understand? So that way, when I go back to program, I'm not creating something that's not going to work for that athlete. Or I spend a bunch of time working through like, oh, we should do this, we should do that. And it's just like, let's have that conversation first, then let's build it. Now let's implement it. And then it's just that consistent conversation. I liken it to, if you're going to like build a house, you're not going to start with the painter. No, you're going to start with the architect, right? You're going to make sure the framework is set. Then we're going to start to put a roof on top of it after we frame it all, right? Guys come in, they do it, roof, and then you work on the inside, right? If we skip those steps, we're going to somehow miss something, and that could be a pretty big problem down the road, especially if it's a large piece from a foundational standpoint. If it doesn't hold the structure we want to build, it doesn't matter if you want granite countertops or not. Like, you have a load-bearing wall that doesn't actually hold any load. So we're going to have a big issue within that framework, within the process we're trying to play, because we don't have these key pieces, outlined and taken care of. And some of those could be as simple as like range of motion, like getting extension back, getting flexion back. We can squat all we want, but if you don't have the capacity to bend and extend the knee to the extent it needs to be, whether it's limb to limb or within normal ranges, we're probably going to struggle with locomotion. Like, you're going to struggle to play your sport, right? Unless I don't even know what sport's doing. You're doing seated, to be honest, right? So I think those are really important for us. And that process can have individuality built into it, but it's never going to be very different. Tissue heals as tissue heals. It's not going to drastically change from person to person, obviously without some, autoimmune things or metabolic things, diabetes, Crohn's, something like that. Someone who doesn't like handle certain nutrients very well. We've seen that a little bit, right? Timelines get extended because they just can't handle the stress of the volume. Within that, though, I think the whole idea is to paint a picture for everyone to be able to accomplish their job, walking away from that meeting, understanding and having perspective of each other person's roles and some of the limitations they have as a practitioner, right? Like my biggest limitation for my job that PTs and athletic trainers don't have is they can use their hands. And they're very skillful at it, right? Like if I were to use my hands, it's going to take me 10,000 hours to figure it out, where you just do that and you do a really good job at that, and I won't worry about it. I will trust that you do a good job. And if we're not doing a good job, like we're not meeting landmark timelines, things like that, okay, let's reassess. Like, what did we miss, right? And I think that helps kind of everyone be on the same page for the goal of it. And then we all speak the same language to the athlete themselves. And when we speak the same athletes themselves, the athletes can focus on the things that matter. And a lot of that is kind of controlling their environment the best they can, committing to the process, being challenged on a daily to build that confidence over time. And I think those 4 pieces are really important to the return to play process, because if they worry about the uncontrollables, they're really going to be focused on the wrong things. And now it creates this animosity from a mental standpoint for their whole entire experience. And we could have just been better to start, to set the expectations early, to set the foundational pieces early, to set the landmarks where they need to be in line with doctors' timelines. Because a lot of doctors' timelines are going to be tissue healing processes and things like that. They're not performance-based things though, right? And that's just, it's a simple understanding of the 2 different thought processes. Just because the tissue's healed doesn't mean it's prepared.
Right. It's marrying that timeline-based approach with the progression-based approach, putting the 2 together, and then understanding where the athlete needs to be as an individual. And to your point, each case needs its own roadmap. You can base certain things off others that you've worked with in the past, but they're all unique. They're all different, right? You know, if you say lateral meniscus tear and ACL reconstruction, and maybe they all had a quad tendon graft, but maybe that lateral meniscus tear is different in all 3. Maybe one had a root tear, one had a bucket handle tear, one had a flap tear. They're all very different, and that's going to change the implications from a rehab standpoint. So understanding the importance of each athlete building their own roadmap. And I think including the athlete as a part of that process, not just sitting down with all of the performance providers, but understanding that the athlete themselves is a stakeholder. And I found the more active they are in kind of mapping out this whole process, the more, you know, they use the term buy-in, but I'm not even sure if that's the correct term for it. They just understand what they're doing and where they're supposed to go, and how those little daily actions that I have them do, like maybe 500 quad sets a day early on in their rehab, actually play a role in that bigger picture. And the more they understand that, the more likely they are, in my opinion, to actually follow through on all of those steps that are needed. I think the other piece, just to clarify, when we say return to play framework and roadmap, and we throw those terms around, I don't just mean the 2-page protocol that the ortho gave you. I don't just mean, you know, the quick 3-slide crash course that you got when you were in PT school, right? I've been there. I know what it's like. You know, you graduate feeling like you run the world, and then you very quickly realize that there's a lot missing, and you really need to sit down and dig in deep if this is an area that you want to get into. If you want to specialize in it, or whatever the correct terminology is for it, you're not going to get there with a 2-page protocol, right? When my dad tore his ACL, I remember his ortho sent over a 39-page document outlining the process. And I was blown away by that. It made me realize, like, oh, shoot, you need to put a lot more time and effort and energy into this. You need to map it out from the start, as you mentioned, because if you don't know where you're going, then you're just guesstimating, right? You're making random turns and hoping you end up at your correct destination. And maybe you do, but that process of getting there won't be repeatable. You won't remember how you got there if you were just making random turns along the way. You know, the other piece, using this roadmap analogy, is there's thousands of different ways to get to that ultimate destination. You know, the turns that you take might look different from one athlete to the next, but ultimately your goal is to get them to the same destination. And as you do it time and time again, maybe you discover some shortcuts or little things that save you a few minutes on the journey. You know, we're not trying to cut off hours and hours in this metaphorical road trip here, if you will. We're just trying to cut a little bit off here and there when we can, while making sure we don't miss any key stops along the way. I think a lot of times people are looking for these quick hacks and all these things that magically shave, 5 months off their rehab, right? ACL, oh, they're returned in 4 months instead of 9. But unfortunately, that's just not the case the majority of the time. But, if we can get you back at 8.5 instead of 9 and everyone's comfortable and confident in that, including the athlete, then sure, let's run it. And I think the other piece to that as well is understanding that we've used the term return to play thus far. Return to play is drastically different than return to performance. Once we get them back to playing their sport, they're not going to immediately be at the level that they were at prior to injury. It's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of reps to get there. And that's okay. It's just a matter of, hey, when do we start this return to play process that's ongoing and not ending? And then we can worry about the return to performance separate, getting them back to that level of, pre-competition or pre-injury performance, or maybe even beyond that level of performance as well, ideally. And I think, to your point, the verbiage that we use around those things is very important, because a lot of people consider return to play and return to performance the same thing, when in reality they're not.
No, and I think that's the hard part. And that's simple verbiage right there. And so, we've run into this a little bit where, let's be honest, there's a lot of names that sound like synonymous, or they sound synonymous to each other. And so, a lot of times I'll get RTS, return to sport. For me, that's return to practice, because returning to practice is your first implementation back to the sport. Return to sport doesn't mean you're playing in a game. And so now we have the technical skill of the sport before we can get to the tactical side of the sport too. That's all needs to be formatted correctly too, because what happens if the athlete isn't appropriately tactically aware or technically sound, they really lack the ability. Have you ever seen Ian Jeffries' agility model? They really lack the reaction time component on it versus the initiation and the actualization side. We might work on the initiation and the actualization, but they don't understand how to speed the processing up mentally because they haven't seen enough. And it's super interesting. We had a couple athletes out, and it's just simple conversations. What was the hardest part? A tennis player, a basketball player, or a soccer player, it was hitting the ball again, dribbling the basketball, just sitting and dribbling. You lose your rhythm. Well, how are they supposed to scan through the defense to decide whether to drive or pass? What kind of shot? Defenders in front, I need to pull up and shoot a jumper, or I need to keep driving the basket, create contact, and finish the basket, right? We're talking about levels to this. Well, let's just peel that away. Can they even dribble? They can't dribble. Let's not go all the way to the game scenario yet, because that confidence piece, I think, is a huge driver. And there was a paper that came out that looked, it was one of the soccer leagues that looked at how important the confidence was in the return to play process. And it's probably the highest metric outside the physical quality that needs to be accounted for. But yet no one really knows how to drive confidence up. And I was like, I think confidence gets driven up by competency. I think you do it enough times over and over and over, and you kind of steer away, and you find this median, right? You're this is your middle road, good days, bad days, whatever. And then we got to just increase that confidence in the skill or the activity, whatever it is. At any point in time that we have a setback in return to play or return to performance or return to win, whatever you want to call it, the grand scheme of it, that is going to be a confidence decline. The confidence will drop no matter what. Well, if I could have told you it was going to drop because our expectations for you were so high for the thing you were doing, we could have what I refer to as graded exposure, which I think follows, general adaptation syndrome, SAID principle. It follows principles of training is this graded exposure, which is essentially we want to overload you with stress. How much stress I give you will be relative to where you're at and what you can handle. And those are the things I think from a basic concept standpoint, we need to understand, because if we don't, or we think it's not important, it's going to come at the expense of the athlete's confidence, which ultimately will slow the process down, because we need to give them more exposure or more time off and more time in between stresses or stressors, which basic periodization would tell us is in the physical sense, it's the same thing. But when you get injured, there's a huge confidence piece that goes into it. But I think we need to make sure that we're actually taking care of that. And that's where like having key stakeholders, say mental performance, would be very beneficial to have to work on those things. And I think they're very powerful.
Building off of that, for me, one of the first synonyms that comes to mind when I hear the word confidence is the word trust. And for me, when I'm working with someone else, it might take a level of time before they trust me and before I trust them, but they can ruin that in seconds. The same is true in relation to confidence in return to sport. It takes a lot of time to rebuild that. And the sooner you start, the sooner you're going to get to that higher level of confidence, right? It could be as simple as you mentioned, dribbling a basketball while sitting down. I mean, I've had athletes doing like wall ball and different things in lacrosse and stuff fairly early on, and even like walkthroughs in practice where it's like, hey, look, you're going to go through the drill, but you cannot go any faster than a walking pace, period. You have to walk it, but at least now you get that feeling of, oh my gosh, I've got my lacrosse stick in the hand. If I was playing at full speed, here's where I'd go. Here's what I'd do. Here's how I would move. And the sooner you start working through those reps, the sooner you're going to get to that state of trust and confidence in restoring that injured tissue to the level of performance that you want it at. But if you're trying to cram all of that into a couple weeks, you're going to rush it. You're not going to get that full level of trust, right? I'll use another example, right? What my ex-girlfriend gave me a key to her apartment. I gave her a key to mine because we had this trust for each other. We had this mutual respect that took many months to build. That's something that didn't come out after date number 1 or date number 2. It took a lot of time to get there. Yet for some reason, we forget those principles and lessons when it comes into the return to play conversation. It takes time. And I know, again, like I said before, a lot of people want to speed this up and try and, rush the process, if you will. And don't get me wrong, there's been situations where that comes up a lot, right? When I was working with a professional wrestler, it's like, hey, look, yes, he just had this scope with his knee, but he needs to be back in 6 weeks, period. There's no 7, there's no 8, there's no 9. It has to be 6, period. So there's times when there is a little bit of a time crunch on it, but that doesn't mean that we look to push the envelope to the point of 4. As you mentioned, there's a tissue healing component to this whole thing, and we have to pay respect to that. And too often I see individuals that don't respect the tissue healing timeline and don't account for the objective criteria. And the combination leads to a very quick downfall. And I think when I say that too, we've thrown around objective criteria a few times in here. I'd love to hear more about kind of what your objective criteria look like for your kind of return to play process, if you will. Let's continue with that lower extremity knee, ACL meniscus type combo that way. What kind of things do you look for? Is it knee extension, knee flexion, certain metrics on the force plate, EMG, VBT? Where do we kind of go in this world of, more data than we've ever had before?
Quick break, because if you're a rehab professional sick of burnout, this could be your answer. Engaged Movement's blended practice model is a proven system built by Dr. Ray Gorman, a PT who walked away from the 55-hour-a-week grind and built a blended practice model that doubled his income while working less than 25 hours a week, and he didn't have to rely on the traditional way of selling sessions to do so. It's all about blending remote and in-person services, stacking monthly recurring revenue, and building a business that finally supports your life, not the other way around. This model isn't just theory. Real providers, including myself, are creating lives of freedom and flexibility without being tied to their schedule. And as a listener, you get free access to the complete training. DM my name, Dan, to @RayGormanDPT on Instagram and receive your free breakdown on the model.
Yeah, no, those are great questions. And I think you have to start with the end in mind. Because if you don't know what you're preparing for, it's really hard to then provide the necessary stress. And so you can look at like match demands, right? Say meters per second at speed, meters per second squared for deceleration or acceleration, right? Jump height, jump volume, like some of these very key objective measurements within the game might be a good starting point. If you have somebody you never worked with, you have no data on, right? And a lot of these numbers that we're referring to are like fairly consistent, right? When it comes to most athletes of this sport, of this position, typically run this fast, typically jump this high, typically weigh this amount. So we have some of those. And then there's just like the comparing your data set to the position itself. right? Do they even, like, from a positional demand, meet those criteria? Like, that'd be far in stuff. And then work backwards, right? If you work all the way backwards to the start, you have that acute phase where typically any surgical ACL, you're gonna have 2 weeks off. Like from a healing process, from the scarring, right? Drugs, not a lot of sleep, like probably not eating a lot of food. So it's not really the best starting point to start to train. And we really haven't done much things at the time. So obviously, like swelling, edema are super big. Tissue healing from the scarring would be super big, and then pain. That's really where I would start in that phase 1, and that would be post-op is what we refer to that. Anything beyond 2 weeks, I would say we probably have a complication within the surgical side, and they're gonna probably go back in for surgery, right? Infection, didn't get it clean, sutured it wrong. There's extreme amount of pain, like something is going on, I would assume. Now, I could be off of my timelines for some people, but generally speaking, 2 weeks is about where we're at. And then that kind of starts our phase 2. And our phase 2 is, we call it RTA, return to activity. And so that's just ADLs for the PT and the athletic training side. Strength and conditioning needs to understand what that means. Like activity is daily living. Can you walk? Can you get something out of the cupboard? Can you go to the bathroom? Like, we need to restore these things, right? We're going to prepare to train, though. That's our mindset. So I'm preparing for the next block of training. I don't want to protect against training. I want to prepare for training. So we're going to return to daily activities, and then I'm going to prepare to train. So what things does that look like? Well, we need to get back full range of motion of said joint. We need to maintain range of motion of all the other joints. So it's a knee, right? Well, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, inversion knee version of the ankle. Pretty important to maintain. Hip, maintain abduction, adduction, flexion, and extension if we can, right? Now, obviously, your straight leg brace, we have to be very careful. I'm not saying like go get into it, right? And I usually leave this up to the discretion of the individual itself. But the reason why we need to understand those things is because if we're going to full range of motion squat or full range of motion anything, that means that knee is going to bend, that hip is going to bend, and that ankle is going to bend. So we need to have a lot of flexion. Well, we know that typically not moving the joint creates a lot of stiffness, and it creates, as some people like to say, deleterious outcomes for the quality of that tissue. Certain tissue quality, you could get rid of it very fast, and it takes a while to get it back. So we want to maintain that. If squatty is what I want to get to, then we need to maintain flexion of the ankle, knee, and hip. Well, we can do that passively, right? Passively with the athletic trainer. If they don't have, a meniscus, if they have meniscus, obviously you're in a straight leg brace for usually 6 weeks, and then you slowly get more and more flexion over time. And usually, from my understanding, it's about week 10 is when you can get back to full flexion, right?
Yeah, it's going to vary a lot based on the type of repair and the surgeon, right? So there's a lot of times I'll get all inside meniscus repairs, and I can passively move them to 90 in 2 to 3 weeks.
Oh, no.
And then once we get to about the 6 to 8 week mark, we look for that full passive flexion. But we restrict them from a closed chain environment for more like 12 to 16 weeks. And that's not a restricted closed chain knee flexion. It's just like, not saying don't do it at all. It's more so, hey, we don't want to go too low too early, because the more you flex the knee, the more you bend the knee, the more compression there's going to be within it, right? Certain ranges, I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe it's like the 120 to 130 degree knee flexion range in particular is going to increase compressive forces like 6 to 8 fold compared to body weight. So it's like we get a lot of compression when we go low. It's not saying that there's, not a time or place for it. There is. It's saying respect the healing that needs to occur before you do that, right? And for me, early on, it's like, okay, well, this is the restriction I have. I can only work to 90. I'll get creative with that, right? And then actually the other piece too is, there have been cases. There's one case I had where this individual had a hamstring graft. He had both medial and lateral meniscus tears, and he had a huge cartilage injury due to the pivot shift pattern that occurs when you injure the ACL. And he actually needed some cartilage work done. So naturally, his knee was a little bit of a mess. For him, he was actually non-weight bearing for 8 weeks, and he was 0 to 90 for 6 weeks. And it was kind of boring, slow. We get him stuck in what I call this post-op purgatory phase, where he meets all the criteria to progress but the timeline is just not there yet, right?
Yep.
So we just get creative and work within our restrictions that way and do the best we can. The biggest thing is, okay, if you are told 0 to 90 period, that's it right now. You need to own that 0 to 90, because a lot of times I see athletes and clinicians who don't own the 0 to 90 in that time that they have. And then once that time is up, they try and continue to run the race. Kind of like you mentioned before in relation to extension and flexion range and gait. It's like, look, if you didn't even get full range of motion back, why are we trying to load our back squat? It just doesn't make sense. And none of those ever end well, in my opinion. And I think the other piece I want to just kind of harp on for a second is I like how I bring up objective things and you initially go right to things like ADLs, because a lot of times people go right to force plate metrics. And it's like, there's a lot of work that needs to do before we can argue over landing impulse asymmetries and peak force outputs.
Yeah.
And if we don't pay respect to that work, then none of that matters, right? And I think the other piece too is we forget that there was decent outcomes with all of these things before the tech, before the data entered the picture. People have been doing this for a long time. So I think the tech, at least for me, it's the icing on the cake, right? Like, it can kind of make things look and feel a lot better, but it's also edible without it. So it's one of those things that it's nice to have, but not necessarily a necessity for me. And I really like and respect the way you've gone about this so far, Zach.
Yeah, I do think you have to, in order for you to have a working model, you have to understand that we need to have multiple levels of money invested in this process. If you have no tech, that's fine. Get a tape measure out. Who cares? Right? We could do our line hop's the most efficient way to look at limb symmetry index. It doesn't matter. I would say it doesn't hurt because the ankle complex is involved. The ankle complex, ankle extensors are pretty important for running, for jumping, and those things. So yes, it does matter in the grand scheme of training. And that's where I think like return to play gets seen as this like taboo thing. And you don't train. If you're in return to play, you're never going to perform. I was at all these different schools and I just would, hey, I'll work with the indoor guys. When I was at TCU, we had the offensive player of the year, and he was in the return to play side. Couldn't clean, couldn't back squat. He had a pitch shark and throw med balls, and we had to do jumping, all that stuff. Player of the year though. Like we think that this idea of this like return to play doesn't fit in the daily side of thing, and that's where like Charlie Weingrof's had a really big emphasis or a really big influence on me with his idea of lateralizations and modifications as a means to get the load we need to the musculature or to the system without having the negative consequences of maybe the pain and that stuff. And so it's a very fluid process once we understand how the framework operates. But back to kind of like those ADLs, right? We like to use the FMS. It's standardized. It's consistent, right? As long as you have inter and intra reliability, I don't really care. But for me, it's consistently across the board, and I can speak the language of it that makes sense to the athletic training and athletic and PT. And so people feel good with FMS. Does it have always the best outcomes when it's isolated by itself? No, it doesn't, because it doesn't involve a lot of athletic things. It just pretty much involves movement stuff, which is our next process in the return to play or return to perform. It's training in the weight room. So I need to assess like, okay, we don't have a good squat pattern. We don't have good hip flexion with a straight leg raise. We don't have good hip flexion within a hurdle reach, right? I don't have a good inline lunge. And there's qualities to it, like subjectively too. And so objectively, like we're trying to identify like what's a good scoring here. So that way, when you do score it, the numbers speak to you versus, oh yeah, there are 3 across the board. It's like, it doesn't make sense. Like all I want to know is, do I need to go heels elevated right away or not? Do you have a lot of forward trunk lean when you go overhead? What's creating that? Are you on a hip space? Is it a knee thing? Is it an ankle thing? What's a limitation? Because if I go back to the athletic training and the PT staff and I'm like, hey, I think they have limited range of motion here. This could be a really good area for us to focus on. What are you seeing? Okay, now we're collectively attacking the problem. And then we're both saying the same thing when the athlete asks, why am I doing all of these things? Well, here's why. And we're saying it from both viewpoints. And now it's not confusing. Then they're like, oh, both these people think I should be working on this and we're working on it. So it should be getting better. This is good. This is providing confidence in the process, right? Our last thing is going to be some form of like neuromuscular control. I like Y balance for the most part. as a means to objectively look at it, right? We can look at left to right asymmetries. We know limited dorsiflexion is kind of a problem. We'd like to reestablish that. The one thing that's super important, and I don't think people truly understand this, there's a difference between ground forces and muscle forces, right? And so when we look at force plates, we're looking at ground forces. We can approximate muscle forces, right? Muscle forces are essentially what's going to pull on the tendon, what's going to pull on the bone, all that stuff. Large range of motion under light loads, even body weight, high amount of muscle force, as long as you have a large range of motion, right? But you might not have a lot of ground force. Well, that's really good for us considering like what pulls on bone, which would stimulate bone, and what pulls on tendon, which stimulates tendon, is muscle. So I can do light loads under large ranges of motion for high time under tension to get the stimulus I want without necessarily crashing the system, right? Really early on. Well, when we do like a Y balance and that knee needs to go over the toe, they need to support body weight. So then you create a decent amount of force into the ground, but the muscle force to drive the knee over the toe and to get a good anterior reach is really high. Well, that involves, one, can the joint even move? Two, can it move under load? Which I think is a really good thing for us to identify, whether it's a limiter or not, for us to be like, hey, I think they're good. On a single leg, they can bend that knee, they can bend that ankle, they can bend that hip, and there's not complete disastrous outcomes. Now, like the Y balance looks at like certain anterior reach metrics based off foot length, right? You should be 2 times foot length in order to do that. I think it's a good place to start, right? If we have an athlete that's never been 2 times foot length and they go into return to play and we're going to hold them back from moving on because of their dorsiflexion, that's just a conversation we need to have, right? Like, once again, these are things we're going to shoot for, but having the stakeholders right at the table and you come back with information, be like, hey, we're not meeting these landmarks, these criteria that we think are important. And we've had 6 exposures to it with no change. Do we need more volume, frequency, or intensity? I don't know how we increase dorsiflexion with more intensity. You know what I mean? Like, there's just, it's probably going to be something where hopefully it increases over time, or you might never get it. And that's just kind of the what I call the Y in the road. We have to choose the path that we think is going to work. We have to understand the limitations to it for us. Limited dorsiflexion probably means you're going to have more of a hingy squat.
It comes back to that importance of individualizing all of these cases, right? There's an athlete I was working with, late stage ACL, and he had a hard time passing a hop test. Well, if you just looked at the numbers, you'd think he was in a terrible place until you realize, oh, he's actually got club foot on one leg. That's going to impact his hop quite a bit. In fact, he was like, I don't know the last time I've ever done a single leg hop before. And it's like part of this whole conversation around the return to play, knowing what your end goal is and laying out that roadmap comes, what were they like before the injury? If you have any knowledge, any data about what they were at, where they were prior to injury, because for some people, you know, they might not be at those 90, 95% limb symmetry index qualities and different things that you're looking for, but they might be a lot closer to it than they were before the injury, depending on what your data shows. So I think it becomes an important conversation to know where they were at prior to injury, where are they at now, and how do you put the pieces together to complete the puzzle? And it's not a one person putting the whole puzzle together thing, because these are complex problems and complex situations that arise. I think everyone thinks that their rehab is going to go just like a textbook until you realize some of these other complicating factors, right? School didn't prep me for someone who had a procedure to correct club foot. And obviously there's a lot of invasive things done on the foot when they do that, at the same time as, you know, recovering from an ACL injury. Or I had another athlete who had a appendectomy because he ruptured his appendix about 6 weeks after his ACL. School didn't prep me for what to do in those situations. And until you get in them, you don't realize how important having that roadmap is, but also being able to erase the lines and start over when you need to, because none of these are like each other. And I think the more robust your framework is, and the more you understand some of the principles that we've discussed so far, getting everyone on the same team, involving the athlete in the process, building confidence and trust within them throughout a long process, and making sure you don't miss any steps along the way, The more you embrace those principles, the better off and more effective you're going to be as a clinician in this stage.
Yeah. And I think it's super important that all those stakeholders understand the value they have in the process. And at the end of the day, we're all trying to get the same thing done. And that's where better questions probably lend themselves to better answers. But if you don't even know what the answer is you're looking for to start with, or the question you want to ask, like, we probably should start there. And that's where that framework and that roadmap really help us. Once we do that, right? I think people are like, oh, that's a bunch of hooey, right? Like, why do you need to do that? And I was like, well, let's do case in point. I don't have a good squat. I don't have good knee flexion in a bilateral sense. Okay, well, how do we attack full knee flexion? Because you're just gonna like bypass it. What are we just gonna take our toes out beyond the rack and do this very heavy powerlifting style squat now? What do you think it's gonna do to the hip? What do you think it's gonna do like upstream and downstream, right? Like these all have consequences, the decision we make. And if they've never squatted like that, and you're going to, and they said they've been training for 10 years, right? They played, say it's a junior in college, something like that. And they played grade school, the high school. Some of these kids start training at 10 and 12 years old. And you go a wide stance, low bar back squat, because that's just the most advantageous to get them to hit depth. You're probably going to be messing up something else. Well, let's just play this out. They have a lack of dorsiflexion. They have a forward trunk lean, say on the overhead squat. They don't have good knee flexion, even with heels elevated. Well, guess what? I'm probably going to trap bar deadlift them because that's how I apply load. I bet you they get great range of motion from some single leg stuff. So single leg press, full range of motion, get as much muscle force as we can, get as much knee bending as we can. Great option. That's awesome. It's not a primary, maybe it is. I don't care, but it's going to be in the program because it accomplishes the goal, which is full flexion. Some split squat, single leg ISO work, right? With the front foot elevated, calf to hamstring, really getting deep ranges of motion, right? Wall sits. There's a lot of different things we can do. But what that information tells me is it tells me what I can and can't do. If I have limited dorsiflexion, limited knee flexion, limited hip flexion, and you go barbell back squat at 5x5 at 80%, good luck. Yeah. Like, it's not going to work.
You have to be, I use the term agnostic in your exercise selection. You can't just be married to one thing and one right approach and one way to do everything, right? You know, all of my athletes that I work with in rehab, they squat, but they all do it different tempos, different ranges. Everything is unique if you look at one to the next, right? One likes back squat, one likes front squat. They're both checking the same box that I need checked. So guess what? I'm here for it. I'm not going to lose sleep over the fact that I'm front squatting one and back squatting another. But, you know, if I was just married to the back squat and I was like, well, everyone has to back squat, then I'm really missing the mark. And my success as a clinician is going to drop as a result because I'm too stuck in my own ways to flex and accommodate to what the athlete in front of me needs at the time. And until you learn to kind of check yourself and look in the mirror, you know, you start repeating that process. And I mean, I say it because I did it with my first ACL or two out of school. It's like, you know, in my mind, I've got it set that like weighted long arc quads are going to be the best thing to get their quad back. And they need a lot of leg extensions, a lot of volume. And what I found was I don't actually have to load those and crush them with, you know, 10 sets of 10 or anything like that. I can get it back in a lot of other different ways. So you learn through what you go through. But if nothing else, take the advice of people like us who have been there and done it before you just make the same mistakes yourself.
Yeah, and I think that's okay. And I think what we're referring to is like, oh, if you have a bunch of equipment, use it, right? But what if you only have slant boards and a barbell? Like, there's nothing wrong with that. I think I would go the route of applying a lot of time and attention early on, large range of motion under light loads, create a lot of muscle force, right? And if you can sprinkle in some isometrics from a high angled position, so that way you get ground force, you have both muscle force and ground force, which is really, really impactful for the next phase of training, which would essentially be like kind of the practice side, right? Where you put a lot of force in the ground, the muscle has to hold, and you have to put enough force in the ground in order to move your system, you know, through space. So I do think that's just like a way to like work around it. But once again, right, that's just a different method to accomplish the goal. And so I think it takes time and creating a robust framework. It needs to be worked through. Like I call it troops on the ground, right? When we built this 5 years ago, Back, me and Mark built this 5 years ago. It was not something that we were like, oh yeah, like this is great. Like I look back 5 years ago, I was like, that was a terrible idea. And we waited too long to load. We waited way too long to load. And it pushed our late stage timeline so far back. Because sprinting, jumping, and cutting have such high forces that you need to be prepared for them. And here's the other thing we haven't talked about. As soon as we move phases within this roadmap side of thing, as soon as we do stuff, it's called intro to bilateral loading, intro to all the intro doesn't mean high volume, high intensity, because I have low confidence. And so sometimes, and this is the practitioner side, right? Where you got to be pretty good on the practitioner side. I might have this planned and athlete's like, I don't feel confident today. I appreciate you telling me that. You're buying in the process. You're allowing me to be, steering you in the right direction through here. I might need to regress back to those intro level days for 1 rep, 1 set, 2 sets, and you build that, and then we're back to normal, right? They just had a blip. There's just something in it and going on with them that wasn't working. The other thing is, day 1, I don't need them to be sore for 3 days from one exercise we did. That will mess up every other person's part of the process. I am now trying to take control because they have been able to squat in the weight room and stuff like that. And I'm just going to make them sore for no reason. Like they're sore for 3 days. Like what person first day back needs to be that sore?
No, you're absolutely right.
You're creating the lack of ability to stress the system. And what we need to think about is we need to stress the system often and early because high loads aren't needed. So we need to build a lot of competency. When you build a lot of competency, you build a lot of confidence, and then you're willing to let it ride and you're willing to let it eat a little bit. And that is where we get that intensity super high, confidence super high. And that's where we start to really get closer and closer to the performance side, right? But every stage of this 5-phase process that we operate within, or I operated within my mindset, is going to be geared, which we're going to intro it, and we're going to slowly increase the intensity. We're going to slowly increase the confidence, and the complexity might go up a little bit too. And so we're getting these layers to this process that allow the athlete to be more prepared for the next phase versus not doing anything that would pertain to progressing them in the next phase and then expecting them to be okay with it or be ready for it. And I think that's where we miss, and that's where we get extended timelines, right? We get these 2-week areas where we overcooked them, right? And we need to go back on. We got to pull everything back for 7 days. And it's like, no, let's just not do the dumb stuff and let's give ourselves a little buffering capacity, right? And so a lot of times these phases, at the end of the phase, I want to almost overdo it so that when I reintroduce or I introduce the new thing, there's a high amount of stress from an internal side, from a mental side. There's like, I don't know if I can do it. There's some of these negative self-talk things, right? But the work isn't that difficult. And so we're balancing that stress. And slowly, as confidence goes up and stress goes down, the mental stress, the work we're doing is going to go up too. And it's going to increase and be overloaded. And then we do the same thing for the next phase. And so there's like this nice periodization, trying to understand both the internal cost and the external outcomes that we want for the individual themselves. And so that phase 3 for us is going to be really just force capacity. What can you generate? How much can we generate? What movement patterns can we get into? What's going to be kind of our drivers for the next 2 phases, right? If you're someone that's never back squatted before, back squat's probably not my end goal all the time, right? If you're someone that's never axial loaded, do I have a pit chart? Do I have a belt squat? Like, do I have an opportunity there to load the lower limbs within that process, right? I think we have to have some tools in our toolbox that allows us to do it. So that force capacity side is super important in that phase 3. And that's that return to training. And then I want to prepare to practice. So we're RTT, return to training, and then we're preparing to practice, which would be that phase 4 side, or a lot of medical timeline would look at like return to sport. But it should be intro to sport. It needs like these verbs and the things we're saying, like they tend to lend themselves to the wrong understanding of what it means. And that's where it's really nice where doctors refer to the athletic training staff or the PT staff, whoever's the lead on the case, to be like, yep, follow them. and they don't try to drive the decision making because they're not boots on the ground, right? They're not the one doing all the work on the day to day. So yeah, the force plates start to get more involved in that phase 3. So we look at like force outcomes. Rate of force is somewhat important, but we're not doing much jumping at all. If anything, we're doing low level plyos, rudiment series, things like that. Things to improve the ankle complex, to be prepared to get back into like running, jumping, and braking. So it really is a good for me and my thoughts. It's really seamless to progress in that manner as long as everyone's on the same page, because now we're not trying to do too much. We're very focused on what the goals are, right? The goal is to get stronger. System load, like how do we improve more load on the system, the tissue, so it can heal, so we be prepared for the running, the jumping, and the cutting, which is super important. I think the return to sport part of the timeline is probably where the most issues happen.
Right.
It is entirely the most. And I think it's like probably close to that 3 to 4 month time span, maybe even 5 for an ACL. That's usually your biggest issues. There tends to be a lot of swelling that happens again. Soft tissue might pop up here and there. And because we're not accounting for everything that's going into it, right? Rehab might not have dropped off as much. So tissue load is really high, but they started running and jumping and cutting. They're starting to practice again. And so now we have a lot of overloading in a lot of different realms, and it's a lot of the same stuff, right? The loading the tissues at the same capacities, the same volumes. There's no progression to it. So sometimes those are the questions that we need to ask ourselves, like, is this necessary for the progress for us in order to get ourselves to the outcomes we want?
Absolutely. No, that's a great point. And it's also essential to note, in my opinion, that some of those issues that you mentioned, they can be avoided when everyone on the team, that rehab team, if you will, is on that same page with the athlete, and they make sure that the criteria that they set to go back are actually adhered to in good criteria, right? If your return to sport criteria is 50% quad index, then yeah, you're asking for a whole world of issues and trouble that way. But if you set the standard to a high level, a lot of times you can negate a lot of those issues that might pop up in other individuals, right? And when I do get athletes that I work with in the rehab side that are having those issues, something was always missed. And at least in the case of the quad tendon graft ACL, the most common one I see is quad weakness. They just don't get it back, and they're coming in, 9, 12 months out sometimes with 60 to 70% quad index. Like, no wonder why your knee doesn't feel good or function like you want. No wonder why it swells up, because you're trying to do all these quad dominant things. I know there's debate on if quad dominant exists, but you use your quad in a lot of sport and athletic ability. And if you don't have the strength, but you're forcing those forces that you talked about through it, even though the muscle's not capable of producing those forces, yeah, things are going to get irritated and pissed off because the body always sacrifices quality for quantity. I also realize that there's a lot to this return to sport conversation, and we could talk about it all day long and still just scratch the surface. But from my understanding, you and Mark have put together a phenomenal resource, kind of playbook, if you will, that will be coming out soon that will probably help people navigate a lot of this stuff and simplify it a bit for them that way. For people who want to find out more about you all and the resources that you've got and so on that way, where can they find you all at, Zach?
Yeah, so probably the easiest place to contact us right now is going to be Instagram, social media, Zach Rockford, or Zach, Coach Rockford, do my tag, and then Mark Jameson or Coach Jameson is his tag. So those are probably your two best places. The company that we have is called HPHQ, High Performance Headquarters, and really just trying to provide high performance solutions to people that need them. And a lot of that involves, a lot of parties, a lot of viewpoints, and it's just our way to try to push the field in the right direction. But hopefully, as it stands, we'd like to have it out early fall, September time. Hopefully, fingers crossed, as we're working through it. And yeah, the resource and the guide are super beneficial. There's a lot of moving parts to it, and we'd like to outline that and then show you the options that you have, I think, to make it a relatively I wouldn't call it a seamless process, but a known process versus a very unknown. And so a lot of that we rethink and re-engineer maybe how you would want to go through it. So that way you have a lot of these questions now ahead of time that you maybe have the opportunity to mull over and answer, or at least have a better answer for it had you not talked about it or not brought it up earlier on. And that's where I think reaching out to people as a resource is super helpful and super beneficial. So this space is definitely being heavily influenced by a lot of people that are getting into it now. In the college model and some of these high performance teams, if you're not all on the same page, it becomes very hard to own your space and to do a good job for the team, your performance team, the team you're working with, say your sport team, and then the individual athlete, because something will get missed. Ego is usually a big driver of that. And usually it's best to try to set that aside. And every opportunity is a learning process. And that's what this book is essentially been put together for, is like all the things we've learned over the last several years of putting together, and it'll get better, with good feedback from people. And so I really appreciate you having me on, though. The book itself has been a big part from a passion standpoint, for us to help the field and help individual coaches and others teams. So I really appreciate it.
That's awesome, Zach. I really appreciate all the insights that you shared along the way there and the conversation. It was really amazing. I'll link to your social handles in the book in the description below too. That way, if people didn't quite catch it, they can just click there and see everything that y'all are up to over at High Performance HQ. Again, really appreciate your time, and thanks for everything, man.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Have a great day.